Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm very glad that SP at ISU extended this invitation so that I could share these ideas with you and get some feedback. A little bit about me. I am a fourth-year PhD student in ecology and ecosystem sciences at the University of Rhode Island. And I'm interested in kind of bridging this gap between science and science communication. So the main question that we're going to be attacking here today in this presentation is it possible to standardize comparison of broader impacts activities by describing what really makes them broad and impactful and effective? And by doing that, can we make addressing the broader impacts criterion as straightforward as addressing the intellectual merit criterion, both when scientists are putting together their proposals, but also when peer reviewers are examining those proposals? I think the answer to that question is yes. And a way I envision us potentially going about this is through what I'm calling a broader impacts impact factor. And I'm going to describe to you what I mean by that as we go through the presentation. But let's start by asking ourselves why scientists and reviewers, when interviewed, tend to feel that addressing the broader impacts criterion is not as straightforward as addressing intellectual merit. And that's partly because these scientists and reviewers, they tend to have expertise predominantly in the subject areas that's covered by intellectual merit, but also there tends to be an absence of a standardizing framework for comparing these broader impacts activities. Now, when we think about these interview responses that we're getting from leaders within NSF, there was a publication by SRI International in 2011, and this stuck really in my mind. Deciding what a good broader impacts activity was never really quite defined, and so they call it a big fuzzy ball. But if we compare this to intellectual merit, there really is a standardizing framework that's implicit. When scientists are proposing intellectual merit projects, they have a good understanding of what reviewers are looking for and what is really strong in their proposals. So it's so ingrained in the scientific culture, it scarcely needs to be spelled out, but I'm going to go ahead and just describe some of these features for you. No matter what a research project is under the intellectual merit criterion, the proposal is going to have certain qualities that make it really competitive. For example, it's going to have a rigorous study design, it's going to have a large sample size, control groups. It's going to be built on a solid theoretical foundation that everyone in the field believes in. It's going to show that the results are going to significantly advance knowledge in that particular topic area. And the proposal is also going to demonstrate evidence that the principal investigator knows what he or she is talking about and that they have the resources to go ahead and fulfill the complete project that they are proposing. All of these things are just part of deciding what is good science. But what goes into deciding a good broader impacts activity? What should proposers be demonstrating or emphasizing to reviewers to say that their activity is going to be broad and it's going to be impactful? What should reviewers be looking for? Guidance from NSF is still really sparse about this, and there are a lot of different kinds of activities that proposers can suggest that they're going to use as a broader impact of their funded project. How are we supposed to compare them on a level playing field? So I think this is where a broader impacts impact factor comes in, and my goal has essentially been to answer this question. What qualities characterize a broad or impactful activity, making them more effective to fulfill the goal that NSF has set out for this broader impacts criterion, but also what's really important to these scientists who are eager for funding is making these proposals that include broader impacts essentially more competitive during the process. So as part of my dissertation at the University of Rhode Island, my objective is to synthesize some sort of standardizing framework of characteristics that can explain the success of impactful outreach endeavors to help guide best practices, not only in the development of broader impacts activities, but also in their evaluation during the peer review process. So essentially to develop a broader impacts impact factor, or a BIF for short. The broader impacts criterion is vast, to say the least. There are a lot of different suites of goals within it, and so picking a reasonable and manageable place to start, I've narrowed my focus to dissemination of research findings, or outreach, or increasing public scientific literacy. It is the third most proposed broader impacts activity across all NSF directorates, featuring in about 20% of proposals. Teaching and training is the highest, most proposed activity in about 60% of proposals, and broadening participation comes in second. So you may ask, why, again, did I choose dissemination of research activities when there's obviously two very popular things that come ahead of it? Well, there's two reasons. The first is that with teaching and training and broadening participation of women and underrepresented groups in the STEM fields, assessing those is a bit straightforward because we're talking in terms of numbers, the numbers of courses, the number of students, the number of people who are brought on board. And assessing dissemination of research findings is arguably more nebulous than that. But the second reason is because teaching and training and bringing underrepresented groups on board, broadening participation, are so popular, in order to make their proposals more competitive, it's typically accepted that scientists have to have another component to that, and that is dissemination of research findings. Something that's interesting to me is that in the Biological Sciences Directorate, there's a bit more of a percentage of people who are advocating this dissemination, and it features in about 30%. I myself do fit into the Biological Sciences Directorate because my personal area of research is bird migration, nutrition, and physiology. And so someone in my field might suggest having citizen science project as a broader impact of their proposed activity, having citizens collect data for them that they're going to analyze, or they could suggest that they're going to perform public lectures and workshops, say through Audubon, it's a very popular outlet, or library talks that we talked about earlier, some other outlet where they're bringing their science to the public, or online, or print articles, any sort of media where they're trying to translate their science for a quote-unquote public audience. But let's pretend that we have 3 competing proposals that are equally valid in their intellectual merit, and they're proposing these 3 different activities. How are we supposed to compare any of them or determine if any of them are going to be impactful at all? Now, there is some work out there, some great work that's been done previously that's been examining trends in the proposals that scientists are submitting to NSF and looking at categories of characteristics that these proposals involved. And for example, a reviewer could look for audience size as a gauge for the impact of a particular activity. Or they could determine the distance from academia that that audience is. Is it students or is it another portion of the public? But a drawback of this approach is it's not really evaluating the quality of the dissemination experience, the quality of the experience for the audience. And these metrics also don't take into account whether the scientist is going about a deficit or contextual model of knowledge building. And also, it's not necessarily gauging whether or not this broader impact activity is relating to a public need or relating to established values that the public has. So my approach has been to examine the outcomes of a lot of different outreach endeavors and to try to find common themes that unite them all. And in doing that, identify these themes that could perhaps serve as an example to scientists who are trying to build a broader impacts activity schedule. So I've been drawing on a variety of sources, and I have come up with 5 pretty straightforward main factors that I think we should really evaluate and consider if we want to think about the impact or the potential for impact for a project. So they're pretty straightforward: the who, the why, the what, the how, and the with whom. So this is an ongoing project, but I'm going to give you a preview of these things now, and we're going to go through each of them, bringing along with us those 3 different hypothetical broader impacts activities that I mentioned. So the who, I think we'd all agree that descriptions of broader impact activities and proposals should define an explicit audience and be as specific as possible, but when it comes to impact, the composition of the audience also matters. To be truly impactful regardless of the activity, it's a really good idea to identify what Thomas Heberlein, a social psychologist, calls gatekeepers or opinion leaders. These are people who hold a high standing in their communities. They're able to leverage the information that scientists are able to bring to them. And so by targeting these groups, we are targeting the people who can act as conduits for a particular message or a call to action. And in this way, they can also exert domino effects in their communities. So I'm thinking here of community leaders, of teachers, of wildlife managers, policymakers, people who can take the information that a scientist is offering and really do something with it. So going back to our examples, what would this look like in practice? So again, we have citizen science, lectures or workshops, online and print articles, all very different things. And of course, the best audience for these different activities is going to depend on what the purpose of this outreach is. So let's just pretend that our aim is to promote conservation of bird habitats, because that's my area, and we're going to promote pro-bird gardening behaviors, because we know that there are certain fruiting shrubs that birds make a lot of use of when they're migrating, and we want to improve habitat. So let's say this is our aim. According to this framework, a highly scoring proposal will be talking about recruiting an audience through a specific bird or garden club or Audubon, just naming some particular venue that they see as having some sort of opinion leader or gatekeeper effect on the community that they're trying to target. And under this context, a proposal that would rank low in this broader impact factor framework would be giving no description of a best conduit audience. So this is essentially asking the proposers to give us some evidence that they've thought of the best target audience for accepting their message and also having domino effects, like I said, through that non-target audience. So let's move on now to the why. The why category explores the reasoning for proposing a particular broader impact activity in the first place. And the biggest challenge here that we've been talking about all morning is getting rid of this myth of information deficit among the scientists who are trying to communicate a particular message. The quantity of information does not equal the quality of that information. And that's pretty known to this audience I'm speaking to here. Is our message going to be compelling, or is our audience going to tune us out? Knowledge does not necessarily reflect attitudes. What people know about an ecological problem is not necessarily going to affect how they feel about it or whether or not they value what we're talking about. And again, this was a theme that came up earlier today. Attitudes do not necessarily predict behaviors. So if you have a general pro-environmental attitude, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to engage in a specific pro-environmental behavior. So if we want to target that behavior, then we have to actually talk about it specifically and make sure our audience knows what we're talking about. Going back to those three categories again, in this case, a low-scoring broader impacts activity proposal is probably going to raise some red flags if they say our aim is to educate the public. Reviewers, if they see this, they should be very wary, because our next question is why? What are we trying to accomplish by disseminating this information? To what end is a principal investigator trying to educate the public? It needs to be a lot more specific than that. So let's say I've done my homework and I've become aware of a particular group of people who have a wildlife ethic or are really interested in bird conservation, and I'm trying to help them understand what they can do for the birds that they love. I would have a lot more of a specific why in my broader impacts activity proposal. So in this case, drawing on pro-wildlife values of local landowners to encourage pro-bird gardening habitats. If I'm a reviewer and I'm seeing this in a proposal, I get a better understanding that this proposer knows what he or she is talking about, and they have a very specific use in mind for the information they're trying to convey. The what category is all about what should be communicated, but in the subtext of an outreach or dissemination project. So ideally, proposers should be able to demonstrate that they have considered the needs of their audience. And particularly in the writings that have come out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, their citizen science programs, they've had a lot of really successful impacts, and that's a lot of the source material that I've used. I've discovered some common themes that keep coming up over and again in these writings, talking about self-efficacy of the audience and promoting notions of empowerment, exchange of ideas between scientists and non-scientists, and valuing non-expert or non-credentialed expert opinions, personal contact between scientists and non-scientists, the audience that they're trying to reach, and also service. So determining, is there a need for the particular information that a scientist has? And we're serving the needs of our audience by providing that information. And if we go back to our groups again, a high-scoring project, according to this framework, will be demonstrating all of these things. And if they're creative enough, even though all these different projects are very different, they have the capacity to demonstrate all of these different facets. So a project is going to seek feedback from an audience. And in this way, it's also a very powerful strategy for changing the practice as well. So if you're engaging in a broader impact activity, you get feedback from your audience, you can change it potentially midstream so that you can better serve the needs of your audience. promoting personal two-way communication, another important facet, and identifying, quote unquote, what you can do so that your audience has a particular sense of self-empowerment and being able to take the information that you're giving them and actually do something that they want to do with it. In a low-scoring proposal, according to this framework, it would have none of these things. So communication is solely one way. There's no knowledge building among the audience. There's no contextual approaches to this knowledge building, and there's no notions of self-empowerment. Our next category, how. And the main idea here is that broader impact activities with the most potential for impact are those that accommodate human nature. And there's a book that I strongly recommend to anyone who's interested in this to read, Navigating Environmental Attitudes by Thomas Heberlein. It came out in 2012. And it provides a wealth of information about how we should perhaps rethink the way we try to achieve particularly pro-environmental outcomes. And part of his discussion is the description of these three guiding principles that he propounds as a social psychologist. They could easily, and I think should, be integrated into the way that proposals are compared. And these three principles are the direct experience principle, the identity principle, and the specificity principle. And the direct experience principle tells that people are more likely to adopt a particular attitude or a particular behavior if they have had a direct experience with a particular phenomenon, so they have a personal stake in the science and they can relate to it on a personal level. The identity principle, that the most ingrained and difficult to change attitudes and behaviors, whether for good or for ill, are those that are most tied to our own sense of identity and to ownership. And the specificity principle, that a pro-environmental attitude, like I said, is not meaning that someone is going to engage in particular pro-environmental behavior. And this doesn't also relate to just environmental, we're talking in general here. If we want to affect a particular behavior, we have to target it. So let's go back to these examples again. And an impactful, broader impact activity is one that's either going to give an audience a direct experience or make them recall one so that they have a very personal stake in the science that's being presented. Ideally, it's also going to appeal to the audience sense of place or to ownership. In the terms of birds and the kinds of work that I'm trying to do, thinking about my garden or my watershed, my state, my backyard birds, having a sense of connection to the science that we're talking about. And or it's going to focus on a particular behavior and the means by which this particular audience can achieve it. And a proposal that isn't competitive isn't going to do any of these things. So it's not taking into consideration the importance of direct experience for people, how much they associate the amount of information that they receive with their own values. Because another important aspect here is that how much we integrate the information that's presented to us depends on how much we trust as source. And does that source align with our own sense of identity? And again, the specificity principle relating to how we can achieve outcomes that are directly related to those specific objectives. Finally, the with whom category. And here, I believe that collaborations are key and they promote a synergy of expertises. And the main idea here that I'm proponing is that scientists don't necessarily need to be experts in all aspects of science communication and their science to have impact, as long as they're partnering with social scientists and social psychologists and professional communicators and professional illustrators, people who have the expertise to carry out the conveyance of the message that these scientists are developing through their own research. And scientists should avoid reinventing the wheel, especially if there's pre-existing infrastructure that is trusted already in the public, depending on what this particular venue is. So like I say here, a biochemist, especially one who's particularly reclusive, doesn't need necessarily to be an expert in informal science communication, as long as they have made that connection with someone who can help them bring their message across. So going back to these three particular examples, a very low scoring, according to this framework proposal, the principal investigator doesn't have any demonstrated communication expertise, and they have made no effort to collaborate with a communication expert. But on the other hand, if a principal investigator has an intra-institutional, so a communication department, or the kind of outlet like SP at ISU, or even if they have an extra-institutional partner, and I've read things about synergies with STEM educational centers, or museums, or libraries, these kinds of facilities that can facilitate the ability of scientists to bring their message. So looking back at all of these factors that I've described, the heart of this BIF framework is that no matter what the broader impacts activity is, certain qualities are going to make it potentially impactful. And comparing these qualities could assist PIs when they're putting together these proposals, but also important, reducing the fuzziness of that fuzzy ball during peer review. Again, these 5 frameworks, the who, the why, the what, the how, and the with whom. And now, as I'm continuing my work, the next step is to put this framework to work. And so for that, I myself have to identify gatekeepers and opinion leaders, people who are going to be able to put this to practice. So besides talking to folks who are interested in how to do broader impacts better, I'm also going to be meeting in the future with NSF leaders, program directors, to kind of gauge their receptivity to these ideas and how they would particularly change or add to them. Because my job is not necessarily to parameterize all this or to weight it. That is up to NSF and to the scientific community at large. But essentially, my goal is to help craft a tool that can aid proposers in building and help reviewers compare broader impacts activities across a wide spectrum. So in closing, I would like to thank Jean and SP at ISU for hosting me here, and I want to thank my dissertation committee who have been very supportive and as I've been developing these ideas, and also give a plug to my sister, a professional medical illustrator who develops these PowerPoint templates for me. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.